The Vietnam War spanned from 1955 to 1975. It was marked by complex political motivations and ideological clashes.
It is the arena where communist expansionism is most aggressively at work in the world today.
However, the Vietnam War was unlike any war that had come before it, because the advent of television brought the brutality and chaos of the conflict into people's living rooms live.
The new communist campaign in Vietnam continues. Just after midnight their time, a band of Viet Cong raiders blew up a power installation and attacked 2 police stations in Saigon. Other small bands still roam the city.
The role of the media in the Vietnam War has been a subject of continuing controversy. Some people believe that the media played a large role in the US defeat, while there are also experts who have studied the role of the media and have concluded that prior to 1968, most reporting was actually supportive of the US effort in Vietnam.
United States escalation had already brought campus disruptions twice before, in 1968 and 1970.
It is important to understand that the kind of stories that are told by what kind of media plays a huge role in framing the mainstream perception of any war or conflict. We have seen in recent times how polarization is created by what media spaces choose to show, and hence controlling the public perception around it.
And into this mixture of subversion and war, of terror and hope.
In the case of Vietnam, for the large part, the reporting focused on the fighting, the battlefield, and on the lies and failures of American officialdom. And most of these stories were being covered by male journalists. Hello, and welcome back to Unslant. It has been quite a while, like a really long while. Well, in this episode of Unslant, we talk to Miss Elizabeth Becker to discuss her book, You Don't Belong Here, How 3 Women Rewrote the Story of War. Miss Becker was a war correspondent for the Washington Post in Cambodia and a correspondent for the New York Times. She has also served as NPR senior editor for the Foreign Desk and has authored various other books covering aspects of war in Vietnam and Cambodia. This book features the stories of 3 female correspondents, all in the backdrop of the Vietnam War, and how the kind of stories they covered broke the official and cultural barriers to women covering war. With the amount of literature written on the Vietnam War and given the importance of media in it, it is almost intriguing that female war correspondents have failed to make a significant entry into the historical accounts of the conflict. Part of the challenge was also how war reporting and journalism have been considered a man's area of expertise, and much of the literature written about reporters in Vietnam reflects the same sentiments. However, unrestricted access to the fighting proved to be an opportunity for over 400 women journalists who explored a variety of angles and made a disruption by what was being told to the world about wars. In this episode with Ms. Becker, our aim was to basically explore how mainstream narratives or public perceptions around wars and conflicts are shaped by who tells the story, what is being told in those stories, and how we receive them. And this book was a great disruption to that. Hello, Ms. Becker. Welcome to Unslant, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I really look forward to having this conversation where we discuss your book, which is You Don't Belong Here, How 3 Women Rewrote the Story of War. So before we dive right into the discussion, for the sake of our audience, maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself, your intellectual journey, and how you came about to doing this project of writing this book.
Okay, I started out directly from graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I was studying South Asian studies, including the subcontinent, which was unusual in those days. Usually Europeans were studying the subcontinent, not North Americans. And part of my studies included the countries influenced by India, Sanskritized Asia, which would be, Cambodia and Thailand and countries like that. And this was in during the Vietnam War era. Naturally, besides being an American and concerned about what my country was doing in Vietnam, I was also a scholar. And I had planned completely to become a full-time scholar, but I became a journalist because I had a dispute with my professor writing my master's thesis. I refused to go to bed with him, and he rejected my thesis and said one thing did not have anything to do with the other. And I knew that my academic career was essentially over then. And I had a friend that, who I met in India, in fact, in Delhi. She was on her way to Hong Kong, and I was studying on my way to study Hindi at the Kendriya Hindi Sansthan in Agra. We met in Delhi, became friends. She went on, and instead of going to Hong Kong, she ended up becoming a freelance journalist in Saigon and then Phnom Penh. So when I went back to graduate school, she kept saying, "Come, come, come, and stay with me." And I said, "Ooh, I don't want to go to a war. I'm, you know, I thought the United States was wrong to be in the war, and the last thing I wanted to be was in the war. But once my professor made my academic career impossible, I said, why not?" And I flew to Phnom Penh, and that's when I became a journalist. Well, I wrote this book because there had never been a book explaining that women journalists made their biggest breakthrough in the Vietnam War. All the memoirs were by men. The famous women journalists were either in World War II, like Martha Gellhorn, or they were famous from the Gulf War. But Vietnam, you didn't know anything about the women, which was bothered me. One, because I was one of them, and I knew that the women who broke through, I knew them, who they had come before me. And two, because it's an important part of the story of journalism as well as women and of the Vietnam War itself. But it took me a long time to figure out how I was going to tell the story. The war lasted 10 years. Maybe 24 women actually got there and were able to cover it. Because in those days, media organizations did not think women were good enough to cover politics in their own country. They were not sent overseas as foreign correspondents, much less to war. Women were not even allowed to cover sports. So nearly every woman who went had to pay her own way. She arrived without a job, without any protective gear, without any training, and she had to, figure everything out on her own and hope she did well enough so that she could stay. A lot of women came and went right away because they couldn't find work. I had to tell that story in a way that was a narrative, so people became involved in the women, but I couldn't tell it with just one woman. It was too long of a story, and I didn't want it to be encyclopedic with too many women. So I decided the best way to tell it would be to pick out the best women in each of 3 categories: the best photographer, the best long form or magazine, and then the best combat reporter. And once I figured out my 3 categories, I knew exactly who the women would be because it was so obvious. They did so much, they did so well, and they were recognized for their work. They became the first women to win some amazing awards. So that was the, once I did that, I knew that I had a book. Then I had to find all the archives, which took me literally around the world. Because my first woman is Catherine Leroy, who's French. The second is Frances Fitzgerald, an American. And the third was Kate Webb, Australian. And so I went to Australia to the home of Kate Webb's sister, looked through plastic boxes filled with letters and things like that, and got wonderful things. And because I was there during the war myself, towards the last years, I had known Kate, so I knew what I was looking for. And that's very important in my research, that I I had a very strong, intimate background, not only with the women, but with the story and how women were treated. So I knew what to look for and how to look for it. So I did that in Australia and in France with Dominique Deschavans, who was the curator for the archives of Catherine Leroy. Both Kate and Catherine died years ago. And then in the United States, I had the archives of Frances Fitzgerald, plus Frances is still alive and was totally open to this book. She was wonderful. So I had access to really intimate sides of their story, as well as their all the work they did, which could have been lost. Then I interviewed the people who were still alive and worked with them. Plus, this was not my first book that I'd written about the war. I had very strong familiarity with the history. And now it was really important to me that this book included a strong history of the Vietnam War so that the reader knew what these women were facing and knew how they reacted to it. I didn't presume ever that whoever was reading the book understood the war. So those are the basic building blocks.
That's interesting to me when you say that you didn't assume the reader to understand what the war was. And it is particularly interesting to me because I think the coverage of war, be it by the media and in retrospect by academic circles, are a lot of times influenced by a lot of factors. And what comes down to an average reader is sometimes a very binary good versus bad kind of perspective. And in the case where the US is involved, the media coverage does a lot of times reflect imperialist biases. So I also want to understand that these three women journalists came from different backgrounds and nationalities, French, Australian, and American. So did their backgrounds influence the kind of stories that they were doing? Also, because a large part of war coverage in Vietnam was largely battlefield or what was different political elites or powers were doing. And I mean, that of course is largely the case today as well with particularly mainstream media. So I just want to understand how their coverage was different and the barriers that they must have faced as war correspondents who were women.
Well, the title says it all in the sense that they were told as soon as they got there that women didn't belong there. And these women showed that not only women belonged there, that they broke through the obstacles. The military didn't want them on the battlefield. The media organizations didn't want to hire them, didn't want to give them work. And their male colleagues didn't appreciate them and undercut them. So they had to get past all those obstacles. And they not only did that, showed a new way to cover war. They did not concentrate solely on the battlefield. They showed the effect the war was having on the people of Vietnam and Cambodia. They showed the effect it was having on the histories, where it fit in the histories of the country. They showed that what the role of the United States was vis-a-vis economics, politics, the societies. They just made a bigger story out of it. It was not simply the battlefield. They showed what this was doing to Vietnam, all classes of Vietnam, just not the elite, as well as Cambodia. And in that process, establish a way of covering war that you see today. Journalists now take it for granted that you're gonna really dive into what this is doing to villages, what a war is doing to towns and villages, not just the elite. They're going to tell you what this is doing to the economy and all that sort of stuff. That was not the case in Vietnam until these women helped open that up. We women were outsiders. The men were accepted by all the leaders of the country, by the American embassy, by all the top. They took them seriously. We were outsiders. So we looked at first of all, we actually interviewed women, which I was shocked that they never did. We, as I said, as women, we saw a bigger picture. So I regularly went to the market and interviewed the farmers who were selling their goods, which seems obvious, but wasn't being done. We went to hospitals after, for instance, my favorite example from Frances Fitzgerald was after one of the biggest battles, when all the others went back and filed a war story, she went to the civilian hospital to figure out how the local Vietnamese were being treated for war wounds and things. And she found huge atrocities that had never been written before. So you follow the story from all these different angles instead of just following how is the United States military doing versus the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong. And then, for instance, and to follow on with Frances Fitzgerald, she did a profile of Saigon, but instead of writing about the beautiful Saigon with the French cafes and the beautiful mansions, she wrote about the slums that had been developed because of the war and all of the displaced farmers and all the displaced villagers, and that no one was paying attention to them. No water, no sewer, nothing. And this was a country where the United States was spending the equivalent of billions of dollars. But that was to support the corrupt system and not to support the people who were suffering. And she pioneered all those works. Catherine Leroy, in her photographs, she became the first woman to win two very important photo awards, the George Polk and the Robert Capa Gold Medal. And part of it was because she followed the story in all of its many ways. She certainly took great battlefield photos, but she stuck with the soldiers after the battle. She stayed with them for days and if not weeks. She showed them their heartbreak when they didn't get a letter they were expecting, showed them being bored, showed them being sick, showed them outdoors praying. She showed a full panorama of their lives. And plus she showed them being horrible to Vietnamese when they were interrogating them. She showed the whole panorama. And one of her big prizes was for, she also was fearless, and she went and she captured a medic an American medic trying to save a soldier. The soldier dies. She captures the medic, then screaming and crying. Then she captures the medic running with his rifle trying to kill the enemy. It's a sequence it was unheard of then. And one of the many reasons she won her prizes. She also covered the war from both sides in one battle, the Battle of Hue, which is unheard of. And again, this is following the story to what seems like a logical conclusion, but was out of bounds in everybody else's mind.
Yeah, right. I mean, even today, I think when it comes to covering wars, a large part of mainstream media represents, civilian lives as mere numbers. And especially when it comes to the post-war coverage, there are very limited stories that are covered. And I think it is important that persistent follow-up to these stories and lives of people who are caught in these wars are done. So, Ms. Becker, you yourself have been a war correspondent. And so in your view, how drastically do you think the war coverage has changed or evolved over time? I mean, we've seen recently the Russia-Ukraine being covered, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, or wars and conflicts in Middle East for that matter. How do you see that has evolved over time, if at all?
Many ways. We take it for granted now that a lot of the coverage in Ukraine is easiest right now, that the reporters will be covering as many sides as possible. They will show the preparations, the damage, they'll show the confusion. And Ukraine is probably easiest, but also probably not, for that reason, probably not the best, but they can show the good and the bad. Because it's in that sense it's quite easy. One country has invaded another country, and so that's one thing. In Afghanistan, the politics were so confusing that the coverage was it was very hard for journalists to get people interested. So at the beginning of Afghanistan, 9/11, everybody was interested. Then the President Bush administration did that crazy invasion of Iraq, and all the attention went to Iraq. So Afghanistan wasn't on the front pages. So that by the time, many decades later, President Biden last summer finally ends the American side of the war. I don't think there had been more than 2 or 3 articles about Afghanistan the year before. That's how little interest there was. There was no interest. Then all of a sudden, then we had a lot of interest, and now it's forgotten. Journalists can do just so much. But one of the things I think the women showed was that it's very important to keep your eye on the story. Today's wars are so different. They're much more lethal. There's less respect for the journalist. Armies are much more willing to kill and to hurt a journalist than they used to. There's also a good side is that the people of the country, the journalists of the country are having a stronger voice, which is very good. I also think it's harder for freelance journalists, such as we were in Vietnam, we women, because as I said, it's more lethal. You have to have a lot of equipment. You need insurance. You need a lot more backing than we ever had. And I don't know if you could survive.
Yeah, and I think with social media coming in as well, and nth number of opinions and propaganda floating in and around of social media echo chambers, that also the perception of wars and conflicts is shaped in a certain way due to that as well. But anyway, going back to Vietnam, which was very much a playfield for imperialist and political powers during the Cold War, and it was also the first time that any war in the near history was being televised live. So I want to understand the political implications that were there to war reporting, and because of that, and the editorial pressures that journalists have had to face, and how it particularly impacted the coverage and the kind of stories that were being done, because I'm sure that there must be stories that were difficult to get around in the media or did per se upset the regime.
The things that come to me immediately is that what was very hard to get into American newspapers were stories of soldiers, American soldiers, torturing, defiling bodies, anything like that. The material you could send it into the United States, but the question is, would the media publish it? Now, they eventually did in many cases, but that's the thing that was most unsettling. But I would say that the Vietnam War was the first and last truly open war. After that, there's the embedment. The military embeds people. You have an indirect kind of censorship in the sense of what they deem would hurt their strategic position. But that didn't exist during Vietnam.
Yeah, right. So since we're talking about these journalists who were women and how they made their mark and the kind of systemic barriers that they had to face in the journalism space and otherwise as well, how far do you say that the media spaces for diverse groups of people or women for that matter have changed, and in this case, American journalism space?
Of course there is, but nothing changes overnight. The role of women in journalism has improved dramatically. Right now, the 2 major newspapers are the New York Times and the Washington Post, right? The executive editor, the top editor at the New York Times is a Black man, and the top editor of the Washington Post is a woman. That's amazing. The women are up and down the ladder in journalism. But don't expect things to just, it's gradually, and it requires constant, little pushing. But it's a huge difference, and you can see it in the coverage. It makes a difference. The more different voices you have, the broader the coverage.
Right. Yeah, so as we move towards the near end of this conversation, I want to know that since the book came out, have there been any new things or perspectives or new developments that you saw or read or, observed? I mean, this is with reference to the theme of your book.
Since the book came out, the response has been very, very positive. People are shocked that they didn't know the story. And so the response has been, these women need to be remembered. They have to be retrieved. The French have been especially amazed by Catherine Leroy. After the book came out, Le Monde newspaper, the big French paper, did a 2-page story about the forgotten story of Catherine Leroy. And then in January, the national radio, France Culture, did a 1-hour radio documentary on her. And I just came back from Paris, where I attended the opening of an exhibit on the 8 important war correspondents, and Catherine Leroy was included in that. Now, it's when you recover your history, it's very important for several reasons. And Kate Webb, we haven't talked enough about Kate Webb, the Australian. There's a journalism prize in Asia called the Kate Webb Prize, which is one of the best awards you can get. You should be trying for this one, for an Asian journalist who covers a difficult, not always conflict, but a very difficult situation with intelligence and bravery. And that's because that defined Kate. She became the first woman to be a bureau chief in a war zone. She was captured, she survived, she wrote a book about it, and she very much believed that the local reporters, Cambodians and Vietnamese, were not being treated well. You never saw their bylines. They worked like crazy. They were not paid well. And so Kate's memory has been restored in Australia. The book is doing very well there. And people are saying, why didn't we know who Kate Webb was? She used to be famous and then she's forgotten. So to keep these role models alive adds to the history and the understanding. If you knew Kate Webb in Australia, if you knew Catherine Leroy in France, and Frances Fitzgerald in the United States, and Frances Fitzgerald is alive and she's done very well, but people had forgotten that her book on the Vietnam War, based very much on her reporting and then her research afterwards, was published when the war was still going on in 1972. It won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Bancroft History Prize. It's the only book on Vietnam before or since to get those awards. And I can tell you there are libraries filled with books about the Vietnam War. But she was belittled. People actually said, oh, she doesn't know about Vietnam. She should never have written that. I mean, there's a lot of jealousy in this. And when a big multi-part documentary by Ken Burns, a famous documentary, came out here a few years ago in the United States, he put down the books about Vietnam that you have to read. He did not include her books. In fact, he included no book by a woman war correspondent. So after my book came out, they added at least her name to it. But it's so easy if you don't push hard to just ignore them or say they really weren't that good and they were flash in the pan. But in fact, they were not only that good, but they made sure that the door was from then on open to women war correspondents.
Yeah, because this book does add up to the fact and the importance of multiple lenses through which one must look at or consume or, for that matter, assess history. Because we know as a matter of fact that who tells these stories and how we receive them does play a great role in shaping the public perception around conflicts.
Well, thank you for saying that about the book first, because the one thing I didn't bring out in our discussion is I told you the whole stories of the women. And usually when you read war correspondent books, it's guys who are talking about how cool they are and so on and so forth. But this one, you knew how they were feeling. You knew the letters they wrote back to their family. I mean, men war correspondents never talk about their families, their parents, or
Very true.
and the love letters, the heartbreaks, how they personally lived through a really difficult time. I would love any woman going to the war to read that book, because those three women are great examples of what you're going to come up against. But if you go, be sure to have plenty of support. You need it nowadays. You really need it for war, and realize it's going to be a very, very intense experience that you no one can prepare you for. But I would also say most of us should spend a lot more time covering our own countries. You don't understand. We should learn what it means to be citizens in our own countries, which means, as a journalist, cover your local news. That's almost more heroic now than going to another country where you're a foreigner.
Very
So,
true.
when women ask me now in conversations like we're having, I say, please start with local. Please cover your countries, because we all need to do that. The world is too beautiful and too dangerous not to do that. To go to a city council I'm going to talk about America. To go to a city council and know how people feel about their education for their children. To go to the school board to see the fights they have at education. To go to the city council and hear people arguing about who gets to build a house there and who gets to build something there. To understand all of these issues, so that you know not only where you come from, but you know how you act as a citizen. So then you go to a place and you say, oh, this is not a democracy. This is authoritarian. Journalists have to be able to know that difference. Or they can say, this government is creating environmental hazards, because you've already looked at the environmental hazards in your place. Oh, this government is encouraging religious strife, because you've covered religious strife in your own country. You know what so the more that builds on your knowledge, because and then also will tell you what your biases are.
Yeah, right. And I think that's an amazing place to leave the audience with as well. And thank you so much, Ms. Becker, for doing this.
But thank you so much for having me. I very enjoyed it.